At Thanksgiving dinner, my daughter-in-law refused to serve me. She said, "I don't serve poor men. You can serve yourself." I didn't complain. I just smiled and got someone else to serve me. The next morning, I took an action that got everyone talking. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Jenny Dalton from New York. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. Thanksgiving always carried a strange weight in our family. It wasn't just about the food or the gathering. It was a test of endurance, an annual ritual where tensions simmered just beneath the surface of polite conversation. I'd been hosting these family events for years, ever since my wife passed, and my children insisted I shouldn't be alone. But this year, for the first time, my son Michael and his wife, Candace, offered to host. I didn't protest. They had a nice apartment, and they made it sound like a gesture of love. Still, as I parked my car outside their upscale high-rise and carried the bottle of wine I'd bought, a good bottle, not that it mattered, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a performance more than a family meal. The apartment was spotless, every surface gleaming like it had just been staged for a magazine shoot. Candace greeted me with a tight smile and a glass of wine she didn't bother offering. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, already turning away. Michael hugged me, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't place, guilt, maybe, or discomfort. My other two children, Emily and Julian, were already there, chatting in the kitchen and pretending everything was normal. The air was thick with unsaid things, and I could feel myself slipping into that quiet, observational mode I always used when I wasn't sure how welcome I was. It's a skill you learn when you grow up poor and survive on reading rooms like thermometers. Too hot, too cold, never quite right. Dinner was called, and everyone sat around the table that looked like it had been curated by a Pinterest board. Candace took the lead, serving plates with robotic grace, smiling too wide, making sure her nails didn't chip against the china. She served Michael first, then Julian, then Emily. She passed me once. I figured it was an oversight. Then, after a moment, I quietly said, "Could I get a plate too?" She didn't look up. She just laughed, sharp and cold, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I don't serve poor men. You can serve yourself." The silence that followed was bone deep. No one moved. No one spoke. Michael looked down at his plate. Julian winced. Emily gave me a sideways glance, half apologetic, half terrified. And me? I just smiled. I stood up slowly, not wanting to make a scene, and walked over to the counter. I made myself a plate like she asked, choosing slowly, deliberately. I even thanked her for the food as I sat back down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw my fork across the room. I didn't ask Michael why he didn't say anything. I'd learned long ago that power doesn't need to shout. Power waits, observes, decides. That dinner continued like nothing had happened. Laughter resumed in pockets, and the conversation turned toward real estate and rising mortgage rates. I nodded along, offered an occasional comment, but I was elsewhere. Inside, I was taking notes. Not just on Candace, but on the silence that followed her cruelty. It wasn't just the insult that stung. It was the implication, the assumption that I was beneath her, that my value depended on what she thought I owned. That Michael, my own flesh and blood, would sit there and let his wife speak to me that way without so much as a word in my defense. I looked around that table and realized something that hurt more than I expected. I was the outsider in my own family. Not because they rejected me, but because they didn't really know me. They thought I was the quiet, old man who had done well enough to retire comfortably, who spent his time reading books and occasionally watching over his grandkids. They didn't know I still owned the company where Michael and Candace worked. They didn't know the apartment they were showing off with such pride belonged to me. After dessert, I helped clear the table. Candace didn't stop me. I think she liked the image. Her father-in-law doing dishes while she sat on the couch with a glass of Chardonnay. When I left that night, Michael walked me to the elevator. He gave me a hug, quick and awkward, and said, "Thanks for coming, Dad." I looked him in the eyes and nodded. "Of course, son." I didn't say what I was really thinking. I saw everything I needed to see. I didn't tell him that his silence hurt more than Candace's words. And I didn't tell him that tomorrow, everything would change. Because there's one rule I've lived by all my life. Respect is earned, but disrespect has consequences. That night, I sat in my study and opened my laptop. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. I wasn't fuming or pacing the floor. I was calm, methodical. I pulled up the employee roster of the company I co-owned and flagged Candace's name. She worked in the marketing department, mid-level, not irreplaceable. I drafted an email to HR and requested a meeting the next morning. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. I just said we had a staffing concern to address. I also reviewed the lease on their apartment. It was month to month, a little detail I'd allowed out of convenience. That would change too, eventually. But first, she needed to understand that actions, especially those rooted in arrogance, come with a cost. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. In the silence of that room, surrounded by books and old photographs, I thought about the journey that brought me here. The nights I worked late in garages, the risks I took, the meals I skipped to pay rent. I thought about how many times I was treated like I didn't matter by bosses, landlords, even family. I never asked to be worshipped, but I demanded to be respected. And the truth was, Candace wasn't the first person to underestimate me. She was just going to be the last one who did it without consequence. The next morning, the sky was a shade of gray that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. I sat by the window with my black coffee, no cream, no sugar, just like I'd been drinking it for over 40 years. I watched the cars move like ants on the street below and thought about how invisible power truly was. People think it's in the noise, the shouting, the flamboyant displays of wealth. But real power moves in silence. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't have to. I never needed people to know how much I had. I just needed to know who I was dealing with before I made my decisions. And now I knew. When I first started the company, long before it became the mid-sized tech firm it is now, it was just me and two friends in a warehouse with busted lighting and a single working bathroom. We worked 16-hour days, ate ramen noodles off old desks, and every time we got a contract, we treated it like a miracle. We reinvested everything. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with no heat and told myself it was temporary. That one day I'd be in a position where no one could laugh at me or call me poor ever again. I didn't dream of yachts or Rolexes. I dreamed of freedom. And when I finally got there, I didn't need to shout it from the rooftops. I bought my silence with ownership. Michael started working at the company fresh out of college. He didn't know I was one of the founding owners. He thought I had a consulting stake, something his mother once told him to explain my periodic presence at board meetings. I let him believe that. I wanted him to find his own way, without feeling like he was riding my coattails. I paid for his education, of course, quietly. When he and Candace got engaged, I gifted them the apartment. On paper, it was a rental under a holding company I owned. They assumed it was part of a company perk. I never corrected them. I wanted to see how they'd treat the man who gave them everything without ever asking for anything in return. And now I had my answer. At exactly 8:15 a.m., I walked into the office. People looked up, surprised. I rarely came in unless it was for a board meeting or a major decision. I wore my usual attire, pressed slacks, a simple sweater, and an old leather satchel I'd had for years. No flash, just presence. I went straight to the corner office I never used anymore, opened my laptop, and sent a brief message to HR. Send Candace word to my office. Immediate. I didn't need theatrics. I just needed this done with precision and clarity. No shouting. No drama. Just consequences. 10 minutes later, she walked in. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and beige slacks. Her makeup flawless, her stride confident. That look she had. The one where she thought she was untouchable. That was the first thing to go. I didn't invite her to sit. I didn't smile. I simply said, "We're terminating your employment effective today. HR will finalize the paperwork and arrange for your severance." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then her mouth fell open. "What? You can't fire me. I haven't done anything wrong." Her voice trembled, half with confusion, half with indignation. I leaned back in my chair and met her gaze, unblinking. You may not have broken any policies, but you failed something more important, basic decency. And I won't allow someone who disrespects others to represent this company. Not while I still have a say in how it's run. She went pale. What do you mean you have a say? That was the moment it dawned on her. That I wasn't just Michael's aging father with good wine taste and quiet opinions. I was the reason her lifestyle existed. I was the reason she had that office, that salary, that apartment. And now, I was the reason it was all unraveling. I own 60% of this company, I said calmly. I helped build it from nothing. I've watched you walk past receptionists without saying hello. I've watched you take credit for work your team did. And on Thanksgiving, I watched you look a man in the eye, your husband's father, and insult him like he was beneath you. That man happens to be me. And I don't employ people who treat others like that. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. Michael doesn't even know. He'll be furious. I nodded. That's between you and him. But you'll be cleaning out your desk by noon. She stormed out without another word. I called HR again, gave instructions to issue a standard severance package, and reminded them not to negotiate. I didn't want to leave her destitute. That's not who I am. But I wanted the lesson to stick. I wanted her to sit in that empty apartment later and realize she never took the time to understand the people around her, especially the ones who helped her rise. Candace thought she was marrying into money. What she didn't realize was that she married into legacy, and legacy isn't something you can manipulate or disrespect without consequences. Later that afternoon, Michael called me. I didn't answer. He called again, and again. By the fourth call, I picked up. Dad, what the hell happened? His voice was panicked, angry, wounded. I stayed silent for a beat. Then I said, you were at the table. You saw what she did. You said nothing. He stammered. I didn't want to cause a scene. She was joking. You know how she is. I closed my eyes, exhaled through my nose. She wasn't joking. And even if she was, you should have stopped her. You're my son, and I raised you better than that. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, softer this time, you fired her over that? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yes, I can't have people like that working in my company, especially not when they insult the very values I built it on. He sighed. She's devastated. She didn't know. Exactly, I said. She didn't care to know, and that's why she's gone. I could hear his breathing, the heaviness in it, the realization that things were more complicated than he thought. What happens now? He asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked out my office window, down at the city below, and let the silence say what needed to be said. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest answer there is. It was around 6:30 the next morning when my phone buzzed again. Michael, for the 5th time since the day before. I hadn't responded to his messages, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed space to think. There was a certain clarity that came with silence, and I wanted him to sit with his thoughts before I gave him mine. I had no intention of dragging this into a drawn-out family war, but I also wasn't going to pretend that what happened could be swept away with apologies and handshakes. Some lines, once crossed, stay crossed. He needed to understand that I wasn't just his father. I was a man with limits, and they had been pushed. By the time I arrived at the office, the tension was already in the air. Everyone had heard by now. Offices were like ecosystems. News traveled faster through whispers than any official memo ever could. Candace's firing had sent shockwaves. People were pretending not to look at me when I walked through the halls, but I saw the glances, the whispered questions, the stifled curiosity. I wasn't concerned. I hadn't built my reputation by being universally liked. I built it by being fair, precise, and unshakably consistent. That's what made people trust me, even when they didn't understand me. That morning, I had a board meeting to attend, and the minute I walked in, I saw that her absence was already being discussed. One of the junior board members, a newer guy with too much gel in his hair and a habit of over-smiling, leaned forward. So, just to clarify, Candace Ward is no longer with the company? I met his gaze. That's correct. Her contract was terminated yesterday. He shifted uncomfortably, looking to the others for support. Was there a particular reason? I leaned back, hands folded over my lap. There was. And I've documented everything with HR. If any of you would like to see the report, I'm happy to make it available. A few heads nodded slowly. No one pushed further. They knew I didn't make moves lightly. And if I had taken action, there had to be a reason worth listening to. But the fallout didn't stop there. Around lunchtime, I got a text from my youngest daughter, Emily. What happened with Candace? Michael's blowing up our group chat. I replied simply. She crossed a line. I enforced a boundary. I knew that would raise more questions than it answered, but I wasn't in the business of explaining myself to people who hadn't lived through what I had. A few hours later, Julian called too. He didn't beat around the bush. Dad, Candace is telling people you fired her because she didn't fix you a plate at Thanksgiving. That true? I exhaled. She disrespected me and my own family, and I won't keep people like that in my company. He was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, good. Just wanted to hear it from you. Around 3 p.m., Michael showed up at the office. Unannounced. I was reviewing quarterly projections when my assistant buzzed in. Sir, Michael's here. He says it's urgent. I paused, then said, send him in. He came through the door with a look I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. Tight-lipped, furious, but also scared. Like someone who knew he was about to say something he couldn't take back. He didn't sit. You had no right to do that, he said. I stayed seated calm. I had every right. This is still my company. He threw up his hands. She made a stupid comment. She was under stress. That wasn't worth ruining her career. I stood slowly. Michael, you and your wife have lived in an apartment I own, worked for a company I built, and enjoyed privileges you didn't even realize came from me. I didn't say a word when she talked down to my staff. I didn't interfere when she took credit for things she didn't do. But when she humiliated me, in front of my family, in my twilight years, that's where it stopped. He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. And the worst part? You didn't say a damn word to stop her. You let her do it. You let her treat me like a man she wouldn't even hand a plate to. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. The one who looked up to me when I came home late from the shop. The one who asked me for help building his first science project. The one who once cried when I missed his middle school play because I had to work a night shift. Dad? He whispered. She didn't mean it like that. She thought you were just being dramatic. I scoffed. You think I've survived poverty, racism, loss, and heartbreak to be undone by drama? No, I've survived because I knew when to speak and when to act. And this time, I acted. He sat down, finally, burying his face in his hands. She's devastated. She feels betrayed. I nodded. Good. Maybe she'll learn something from that. Maybe you both will. We sat there in silence for a long minute. He didn't look up, and I didn't soften. Eventually, he asked, is this going to affect the lease too? I didn't answer right away. Then I said, let's take one thing at a time. He looked up, and I could see the betrayal etched in every line of his face. Not because of what I did, but because now he knew what I had been willing to let slide all these years. And now that leash was gone. That night, I poured myself a glass of scotch and sat on the balcony of my home, the city lights blinking back at me like a million unanswered questions. I thought about all the times I bit my tongue, all the times I let Candace's sharp comments pass because I didn't want to rock the boat. I'd smiled through microaggressions, laughed off slights, pretended not to notice when she acted like being married to Michael gave her more power than I ever had. But there comes a time in every man's life when silence becomes complicity, and I would not be complicit in my own erasure. Not in my company, not in my family, and not at my dinner table. I knew Michael and Candace would spin their own version of the story. I knew whispers would grow louder in the weeks to come. But I didn't care. I wasn't looking for validation. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was enforcing a boundary. I'd earned the right to be respected. And if someone couldn't manage that, then they didn't deserve a seat at my table or a paycheck with my signature at the bottom. By Friday, the story had spread like a stain on white linen. What started as a private decision within company walls was now dinner table conversation across family group chats and social media circles. Candace had taken to Facebook with a cryptic post, one of those long, meandering monologues meant to sound dignified but dripping with victimhood. When you build your life with someone, only to be torn down by their blood, you realize not all family is family, she wrote. No names. No specifics. But anyone who knew us understood exactly who she was talking about. She made sure of it by tagging Michael and uploading a moody black and white photo of herself looking off into the distance like a betrayed heroine in a soap opera. The comments were full of faux support. You deserve better, Queen. You don't need toxic energy in your life. And my personal favorite, cut off anyone who doesn't uplift you, even if they're old and bitter. I didn't respond. I didn't even flinch. I'd been alive long enough to know that the loudest people in the room were often the most unsure of themselves. But what did catch my attention was how the post bled into the professional world. A colleague of mine, an old friend named Harold who sat on 2 of the same industry boards I did, called me up. "You all right?" he asked. I could hear the hesitation in his voice, like he wasn't sure whether to treat me like a victim or a villain. "I'm fine," I replied. "Why?" He hesitated again, then said, "Well, there's talk. About nepotism. About power plays. You know how fast these things go." I sighed and leaned back in my chair. I know how fast lies travel. Truth usually shows up late, but stays longer. Emily came over that evening, unannounced. She'd always had a sixth sense for tension. Ever since she was a little girl, she could read the air like a barometer. She walked into the house with takeout and wine like she used to when she was in college and needed a quiet night with her old man. We didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes, just the sounds of plastic lids being removed and wine being poured. "Finally," she said, "I read the post." I didn't respond. She took a sip of wine and looked at me. "She's making you out to be some controlling tyrant who can't handle a joke." I raised an eyebrow. "You think it was a joke?" Emily shook her head. "No. I think she meant every word." That gave me a little comfort. Not because I needed validation, but because Emily had always been the neutral one. The peacemaker. If even she saw through Candace's performance, then I knew the truth wasn't completely buried under her drama. "Julian agrees with you," she added. "He's been quiet in the chat, but he told me he was proud of you for standing your ground." I nodded, grateful for the confirmation. Then she looked at me more seriously. "But Michael, he's a mess. He's drinking more. He's not sleeping. He thinks you blew up his marriage." I didn't answer right away. I let the weight of that sit between us like an untended wound. "I didn't blow it up," I finally said. "I just stopped pretending I didn't see the cracks." Candace's version of events had also made its way to a few employees at the company. One of the marketing assistants, young kid named Layla, sent an anonymous email to HR claiming I had acted unprofessionally. She didn't know I could see every email sent to the executive board. Her concerns weren't about legality. They were about optics, about how things looked. "We should protect female employees from retaliation," she wrote. I forwarded it to our legal team and requested a standard review. Not because I was worried. I had documented everything. But because I wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction of calling me sloppy. I built my empire brick by brick. There would be no cracks in my foundation now. What stung the most, though, was that none of this had to happen. If Candace had simply treated me like a human being, if Michael had stood up just once, things might have gone differently. I might have let her smug attitude slide again. I might have ignored the passive-aggressive comments, the snide remarks about old-fashioned values, the way she'd always dismissed my stories at dinner like they were relics of a world that didn't matter anymore. But when you've spent your life fighting to be seen, when you've clawed your way from nothing and still carry the weight of every disrespect you swallowed to survive, there comes a point when you just stop swallowing. And when that day comes, it doesn't matter if it's Thanksgiving or a Tuesday afternoon. You choose yourself. 2 days later, Michael showed up at my house again. This time, he wasn't angry. He looked tired, defeated. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and his eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. I opened the door and stepped aside. He walked in without a word. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place he used to do his homework as a kid. I waited. Eventually, he spoke. "She wants to move out of the apartment," he said. "She doesn't want to live in something that feels like charity." I didn't say anything. He looked up at me. "Is that what it was? Charity?" I took a deep breath and leaned forward. "It was love," I said. "It was giving my son a head start, a chance to build without the burden I had. But if she can't handle that, then maybe she shouldn't have accepted it to begin with." He rubbed his face with both hands. "She's not a bad person, Dad. She's just proud." I laughed softly. Pride without humility is poison. and she tried to poison my table. He looked up again, his eyes wet. I don't know what to do. I love her. But I hate what this is doing to us. I nodded. That's not a choice I can make for you. But I made mine, and I won't apologize for it. The conversation ended with no hugs, no resolution. Just silence. Again. But this silence was different. It wasn't the kind that comes from anger. It was the kind that comes from understanding something painful and irreversible. We had both seen each other clearly now. No illusions. No false peace. Just two men trying to reconcile the blood between them with the wounds that blood had caused. And as he left, I watched him walk to his car and sit there for a long time before driving off. The days that followed were eerily quiet, as if the storm had passed, but left behind a stillness that felt more suffocating than peaceful. The air in my house felt heavier, as though it remembered all the words left unsaid in that kitchen, still echoing through the walls. I went about my routine. Coffee at 6, walk at 7, review company reports by 9, but something had shifted. It wasn't regret. I didn't doubt what I had done. It was the absence of something else, maybe connection, or the naive hope that blood alone would hold us together. Michael hadn't called. Candace, of course, had gone radio silent. But I could feel them both circling like wounded animals, trying to decide if it was worth stepping back into the fire. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the knock came. Not a gentle tap or the polite buzz of the doorbell. It was a hard, purposeful knock. I already knew who it was before I even opened the door. Michael stood there, dressed in a rumpled blazer, his tie loose and eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Behind him, Candace stood stiffly, arms crossed, lips pursed in a line so tight it looked painful. I stepped aside wordlessly and let them in. We walked to the living room like strangers forced to sit for mediation. I took my seat in the old leather armchair. They sat on the couch, leaving a space between them that felt symbolic. No one spoke at first. Then Candace broke the silence with a voice sharp as glass. "You embarrassed me," she said, her tone clipped. "You humiliated me. Fired me like some intern, like I didn't matter." I watched her carefully. There wasn't an ounce of remorse in her face, just indignation. The kind of self-righteousness that grows in people who've never been told no by someone they can't dismiss. I spoke slowly, deliberately. "No, Candace. You embarrassed yourself. You insulted a man who sat quietly at your table, who supported you, and who asked for nothing but basic respect. You mocked me because you thought I had nothing to offer. That's the kind of mistake you don't get to make twice." She scoffed. "It was a joke. You people are so sensitive." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, you people?" Michael flinched. Candace opened her mouth, then closed it. "I didn't mean it like that." I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "That's the problem, Candace. You never mean it like that. But the venom's always there, under the surface. The condescension, the superiority. And the worst part? You thought I was too small to fight back." Her face flushed, but she didn't look away. Michael finally spoke. "Dad, this isn't helping. We came here to talk, not to rehash the fight." I turned to him. "No, Michael. You came here because you're finally seeing the consequences. You sat at that table and said nothing. You let her speak to me like I was beneath her, and by your silence, you agreed with her. That's not just disappointing, it's heartbreaking." His face contorted, equal parts guilt and frustration. What was I supposed to do? Make a scene? Call her out in front of everyone? I stood now, unable to sit still. You were supposed to have a spine. You were supposed to defend your father. Not for his sake, but for your own. Because if you can't stand up for the people who raised you, then what kind of man are you becoming? Michael stood too, his fists clenched at his sides. I was trying to keep the peace. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Peace built on disrespect isn't peace. It's surrender. Candace shifted uncomfortably, but still said nothing. I looked at both of them now, my voice quieter but firmer than before. I've spent my life building something from nothing. I gave my kids the life I never had. I never asked for worship, just decency. And the fact that I have to stand here and explain why a cruel comment at Thanksgiving matters, that tells me everything I need to know. For a brief moment, the room was silent again. Michael looked like he was about to say something, but instead he sat back down and stared at the floor. Candace's expression had hardened into something unreadable. She finally spoke, her tone softer but no less defensive. So what now? You got what you wanted. I'm fired. Everyone's talking. You win. I met her eyes. This was never about winning. It was about drawing a line. And now that line's been drawn, I won't erase it. She narrowed her eyes. So that's it. We're just cut off. I nodded. Until there's accountability? Yes. Michael stood again, slower this time. He looked at me with something that almost resembled the boy I once knew. And if I decide to stay with her, choose her? I stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then I'll still love you. You're my son. But I won't make space in my life for people who can't see the value of respect. Not anymore. His eyes welled up, and for a second, I thought he might cry. But he blinked it back and nodded. I guess we'll figure it out. I hope you do, I said. But I won't do it for you. They left quietly, with no dramatic slamming of doors, no final words hurled over shoulders. Just silence again. And as I watched them go, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop carrying a weight that wasn't yours to begin with. I sat back in my chair, the air suddenly feeling lighter, the house less suffocating. I knew the days ahead would be colder. Maybe I wouldn't see Michael at Christmas. Maybe family dinners would be smaller, quieter. But at least they'd be honest. At least they'd be filled with people who knew how to treat one another like human beings. Later that evening, I received a text from Julian. He told her off. Not publicly, but in private. Said she crossed a line. Just thought you should know. I read it twice, let it sink in. Maybe it wasn't redemption. Maybe it wasn't enough. But it was a start. A flicker of self-awareness in the wreckage of pride. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I just sat there, staring out the window at the streetlights, feeling the weight shift off my shoulders. Finally, decisively, for good. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. It wasn't quite peace, but it was something close. Something sturdier. Something real. There were no more phone calls from Michael. No updates from Emily or Julian unless I asked. Christmas came and went with fewer faces around the dinner table, and while the silence was noticeable, it wasn't empty. It was deliberate. It was mine. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was living in a house that respected its own walls. I wasn't sure if I'd lost a son or just a version of him I could no longer hold on to. But either way, I knew I had found something else in the process, my boundary and the strength to defend it. I'd thought about reaching out more than once. Each time I'd walk past the phone, the impulse would rise like a tide. Call him. Just check in. Just ask how he's doing. But I'd always stop myself. Not because I didn't love him. God knows I did. But love that comes at the cost of self-respect is a debt I'm no longer willing to pay. For years, I'd played the role of the forgiving father, the quiet supporter, the man who swallowed small slights in the name of family unity. But this was different. This wasn't just about a cruel comment at dinner. It was about being erased. About being treated like a relic to be tolerated, not a man to be respected. It wasn't just Thanksgiving. The signs had been there for years, hidden in the way Candace spoke to service staff when we went out to dinner, or how she always seemed to correct me when I told stories about my past, like her version of events was more accurate than the one I lived. It was the subtle eye rolls, the tight-lipped smiles, the way she always called my house quaint, with that inflection that said it was beneath her standards. I'd watched it all unfold from the corner of rooms, quietly noting every little cut she dealt. But I said nothing, thinking I could outlove her pride, that if I just stayed steady long enough, she'd come around. She didn't. A month after the confrontation, I got a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a text, a handwritten letter. I knew the handwriting before I opened it. Michael's. It was short. No long explanations. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Dad, I see it now. I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I still love her, but I understand why you did what you did. I hope, one day, we can sit together again, not as boss and son-in-law, but as father and son. I read it 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it in the drawer of my nightstand. I didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something about that letter told me the door wasn't locked, just closed for now. I don't believe in grudges. They're too heavy to carry, and they sour the soul faster than grief. But I do believe in consequences. I believe in the kind of boundaries that protect dignity, even at the cost of closeness. And I believe that love, real love, isn't about blind forgiveness. It's about choosing each other with open eyes, again and again. Candace didn't choose me that day at Thanksgiving. Michael didn't either. And so, I chose myself. It's a decision I still carry with clarity, one that doesn't twist in my gut or keep me up at night. I sleep better now. Lighter. Clearer. Some Sundays, Julian stops by with groceries I didn't ask for, and we talk politics over the kitchen table. Emily calls during her evening walks, her voice breathless from the cold, always asking if I've eaten. The family didn't fall apart. It just trimmed its dead branches. And though that pruning was painful, it was also necessary. I don't think Candace will ever apologize. People like her rarely do. But I no longer need her to. Her silence is apology enough. Her absence, a confession of everything she couldn't say. One afternoon, while walking past their old apartment building, I stopped across the street and stared up at the balcony that once held my son's future. They had moved out weeks ago, according to the building manager. A young couple lived there now, freshly married, judging by the nameplate. I watched the woman water a row of succulents, her hair tied in a loose bun, smiling as she adjusted each plant to catch the sun. Life goes on, I thought. Spaces refill, wounds scar over, and if we're lucky, the things we lose make room for the things we never knew we needed. I know people will judge me. Some already have. To them, I'm the father who overreacted, who let pride ruin a family. But those people never sat at that table. They didn't hear her words, or see the way my son looked away when I needed him most. They didn't carry the weight of silence through a lifetime of being dismissed, underestimated, overlooked. This wasn't about pride. It was about preservation. About deciding that I would no longer shrink in rooms I helped build, no longer accept a role in a family where I was only loved in theory, but not in practice. If Michael ever comes back, truly comes back, I'll be here. Not as the man who gave him everything, but as the man who gave himself permission to stop giving when it became too costly. That's the lesson I want him to learn. That love is not a license for disrespect. That family, while sacred, should never be weaponized to silence someone's pain. I hope, one day, he looks back and realizes I didn't fire Candace because I was angry. I did it because I was tired. Tired of playing humble while being humiliated. Tired of pretending that loyalty and love were the same thing. So here I am now, sitting in the same chair where I've watched decades pass by through my living room window. I'm older, yes, but I'm not bitter, not broken. I'm simply aware. Aware that sometimes standing alone is better than standing among people who make you feel small. That sometimes silence is the answer, and distance is the boundary you didn't know you needed. And above all, I'm aware of this. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self-respect. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, you already know how this story ends. Family is not immunity from consequences. And love without respect isn't love at all. Tell me in the comments, have you ever stood alone to stand tall? Let's talk about it. See you soon in the next story.